Chapter 7. In the Engine Room. There was a box at the so-called Butyrki station, the famous frisking box where new arrivals were searched. It had space enough for 5 or 6 jailers to process up to 20 Zeks in one batch. Now, however, it was empty and the rough-hewn search tables had nothing on them. Over at one side of the room, seated behind the small nondescript table beneath a small lamp, was a neat black-haired NKVD major. Patient boredom was what his face chiefly revealed. The intervals during which the Zeks were brought in and let out one by one were a waste of his time. Their signatures could have been collected much, much faster. He indicated that I was to sit down on the stool opposite him, on the other side of his table. He asked my name. To the right and left of the inkwell lay 2 piles of white papers the size of a half-sheet of typewriter paper, all looking much the same. In format, they were just like the fuel requisitions handed out in apartment house management offices, or warrants in official institutions for purchase of office supplies. Leafing through the pile on the right, the major found the paper which referred to me. He pulled it out and read it aloud to me in a bored patter. I understood I had been sentenced to 8 years. Immediately, he began to write a statement on the back of it, with a fountain pen, to the effect that the text had been read to me on that particular date. My heart didn't give an extra half-beat. It was all so everyday and routine. Could this really be my sentence, the turning point of my life? I would have liked to feel nervous, to experience this moment to the full, but I just couldn't. And the major had already pushed the sheet over to me, the blank side facing up, and a schoolchild's 7-kopeck pen, with a bad point that had lint on it from the inkwell, lay there in front of me. No, I have to read it myself. Do you really think we would deceive you? The major objected lazily. Well, go ahead, read it. Unwillingly, he let the paper out of his hand. I turned it over and began to look through it with deliberate slowness. Not just word by word, but letter by letter. It had been typed, but what I had in front of me was not the original, but a carbon. Extract from a decree of the OSO of the NKVD of USSR of July 7th, 1945. All of this was underscored with a dotted line, and the sheet was vertically divided with a dotted line. Case heard, accusation of so-and-so, decreed to designate for so-and-so, name, for anti-Soviet propaganda and for an attempt to create an anti-Soviet organization, 8 years in collective labor camps. Was I really just supposed to sign and leave in silence? I looked at the major to see whether he intended to say something to me, whether he might provide some clarification. No, he had no such intention. He had already nodded to the jailer at the door to get the next prisoner ready. To give the moment at least a little importance, I asked him with a tragic expression, "But really, this is terrible. 8 years? What for?" And I could hear how false my own words sounded. Neither he nor I detected anything terrible. Right there. The major showed me once again where to sign. I signed. I could simply not think of anything else to do. In that case, allow me to write an appeal right here, after all. The sentence is unjust. As provided by regulations, the major assented with a nod, placing my sheet of paper on the left-hand pile. Let's move along, commanded the jailer. And I moved along. I had not really shown much initiative. Georgie Tenno, who, to be sure, had been handed a paper worth 25 years, answered, After all, this is a life sentence. In olden times, they used to beat the drums and assemble a crowd when a person was given a life sentence. And here it's like being on a list for a soap ration. 25 years and run along. Arnold Rappaport took the pen and wrote on the back of the verdict, I protest categorically this terroristic illegal sentence and demand immediate release. The officer who handed it to him had at first waited patiently, but when he read what Rappaport had written, he was enraged and tore up the paper with a note on it. So what? The term remained in force anyway. This was just a copy. Vera Korneieva was expecting 15 years, and she saw with delight there was a typo on the official sheet. It read only 5. She laughed her luminous laugh and hurried to sign before they took it back. The officer looked at her dubiously. Do you understand what I read to you? Yes, thank you very much. 5 years in corrective labor camps. The 10-year sentence of Janos Rosas was read to him in the corridor in Russian without any translation. He signed it, not knowing it was his sentence, and he waited a long time afterward for his trial. Still, later, when he was in camp, he recalled the incident very vaguely and realized what had happened. The OSO was nowhere mentioned in either the Constitution or the Code. However, it turned out to be the most convenient kind of hamburger machine, easy to operate, undemanding, and requiring no illegal lubrication. The Code existed on its own, and the OSO existed on its own, and it kept on deftly grinding without all the Code's 205 articles, neither invoking them nor even mentioning them. As they used to joke in camp, there is no court for nothing, for that there is an OSO. Of course, the OSO itself also needed, for convenience, some kind of operational shorthand, but for that purpose it worked out on its own a dozen letter articles which made operations very much simpler. It wasn't necessary, when they were used, to cudgel your brains trying to make things fit the formulations of the Code, and they were few enough to be easily remembered by a child. Some of them we have already described. ASA, Anti-Soviet Agitation, KRD, Counter-Revolutionary Activity, KRTD, Counter-Revolutionary Trotskyite Activity, and that T made the life of a Zek in camp much harder, PSH, Suspicion of Espionage, espionage that went beyond the bounds of suspicion was handed over to a tribunal, SVPSH, Contacts leading to a suspicion of espionage, KRM, Counter-Revolutionary Thought, VAS, Dissemination of Anti-Soviet Sentiments, SOE, Socially Dangerous Element, SVE, Socially Harmful Element, PD, Criminal Activity, a favorite accusation against former camp inmates if there was nothing else to be used against them. And then, finally, there was the very expansive category, CHS, member of a family of a person convicted under one of the foregoing letter categories. It has to be remembered that these categories were not applied uniformly and equally among different groups and in different years, but as with the articles of the Code and the sections in special decrees, they broke out in sudden epidemics. There is one more qualification. The OSO did not claim to be handing down a sentence. It did not sentence a person, but, instead, imposed an administrative penalty. And that was the whole thing in a nutshell. Therefore it was, of course, natural for it to have juridical independence. But even though they did not claim that the administrative penalty was a court sentence, it could be up to 25 years and include deprivation of titles, ranks, and decorations, confiscation of all property, imprisonment, deprivation of the right to respond. Thus a person could disappear from the face of the earth with the help of the OSO even more reliably than under the terms of some primitive court sentence. The OSO enjoyed another important advantage in that its penalty could not be appealed. There was nowhere to appeal to. There was no appeals jurisdiction above it, and no jurisdiction beneath it. It was subordinate only to the Minister of Internal Affairs, to Stalin, and to Satan. Another big advantage the OSO had was speed. This speed was limited only by the technology of typewriting. And last but not least, not only did the OSO not have to confront the accused face to face, which lessened the burden on inter-prison transport, it didn't even have to have his photograph. At a time when the prisons were badly overcrowded, this was a great additional advantage because the prisoner did not have to take up space on the prison floor or eat bread once his interrogation had been completed. He could be sent off to the camp immediately and put to honest work. The copy of the sentence could be read to him much later. All the articles of the Code have become encrusted with interpretations, directions, instructions. And if the actions of the accused are not covered by the Code, he can still be convicted. By analogy, What opportunities? Simply because of his origins. 7-35, belonging to a socially dangerous milieu. For contacts with dangerous persons. Here's scope for you. Who is dangerous and what contacts consist of, only the judge can say. But one should not complain about the precise wording of our published laws either. On January 13th, 1950, a decree was issued re-establishing capital punishment. One is bound, of course, to consider that capital punishment never did depart from Beria's cellars. And the decree stated that the death sentence could not be imposed on subversives, diversionists. What did that mean? It didn't say. Iosif Vissarionovic loved it that way. Not to say all of it, just to hint. Did it refer only to someone who blew up the rails with TNT? It didn't say. We had long since come to know what a diversionist was. Someone who produced goods of poor quality was a diversionist. But what was a subversive? Was someone subverting the authority of the government, for example, in a conversation on a streetcar? Or if a girl married a foreigner? Wasn't she subverting the majesty of our motherland? But it was not the judge who judges. The judge only takes his pay. The directives did the judging. The directive of 1937, 10 years, 20 years, execution by shooting. The directive of 1943, 20 years at hard labor, hanging. The directive of 1945, 10 years for everyone, plus 5 of disenfranchisement, manpower for 3 5-year plans. The directive of 1949, everyone gets 25. The machine stamped out the sentences. The prisoner had already been deprived of all rights when they cut off his buttons on the threshold of state security, and he couldn't avoid a stretch. The members of the legal profession were so used to this that they fell on their faces in 1958 and caused a big scandal. The text of the projected new Fundamental Principles of Criminal Prosecution of the USSR was published in the newspapers, and they'd forgotten to include any reference to possible grounds for acquittal. The government newspaper issued a mild rebuke. The impression might be created that our courts only bring in convictions. But just take the jurist's side for a moment. Why, in fact, should a trial be supposed to have 2 possible outcomes when our general elections are conducted on the basis of 1 candidate? An acquittal is, in fact, unthinkable from the economic point of view. It would mean that the informers, the state security officers, the interrogators, the prosecutor's staff, the internal guard in the prison, and the convoy had all worked to no purpose. Here is one straightforward and typical case that was brought before a military tribunal. In 1941, the Security Operations Branch of our inactive army stationed in Mongolia was called on to show its activity and vigilance. The military medical assistant, Glazovsky, who was jealous of Lieutenant Pavel Cholpanyev because of some woman, realized this. He addressed 3 questions to Cholpanyev when they were alone. 1. Why, in your opinion, are we retreating from the Germans? Cholpanyev's reply, they have more equipment and they were mobilized earlier. Lazovsky's counter, no, it's a maneuver. We're decoying them. 2. Do you believe the Allies will help? Cholpanyev, I believe they'll help, but not from unselfish motives. Lazovsky's counter, they are deceiving us. They won't help at all. They won't help us at all. 3. Why was Voroshilov sent to command the Northwest Front? Cholpanyev answered and forgot about them, and Glazovsky wrote a denunciation. Cholpanyev was summoned before the political branch of the division and expelled from the Komsomol for a defeatist attitude, for praising German equipment, for belittling the strategy of our high command. The loudest voice raised against him belonged to the Komsomol organizer Kaligin, who had behaved like a coward at the Battle of the Khalkhin Gol in Cholpanyev's presence, and therefore found it convenient to get rid of the witness once and for all. Cholpanyev's arrest followed. He had one confrontation with Glazovsky. Their previous conversation was not even brought up by the interrogator. One question was asked, "Do you know this man?" "Yes." "Witness, you may leave." The interrogator was afraid the charge might fall through. Depressed by his month's incarceration in the sort of hole in the ground we have already described, Chelpenyev appeared before a military tribunal of the 36th Motorized Division. Present were Lebedev, the divisional political commissar, and Slesarev, the chief of the political branch. The witness Lazovsky was not even summoned to testify. However, after the trial, to document the false testimony, they got Lazovsky's signature and that of the political commissar Serygin. The questions the tribunal asked were, "Did you have a conversation with Lazovsky? What did he ask you about? What were your answers?" Naively, Chelpenyev told them. He still couldn't understand what he was guilty of. "After all, many people talk like that," he innocently exclaimed. The tribunal was interested. "Who? Give us their names." But Chelpenyev was not of their breed. He had the last word. "I beg the court to give me an assignment that will mean my death, so as to assure itself once more of my patriotism." And, like a simple-hearted warrior of old, "Me and the person who slandered me, both of us together." "Oh no, our job is to kill off all those chivalrous sentiments in the people. Lazovsky's duty was to hand out pills, and Serygin's duty was to indoctrinate the soldiers. Whether or not you died wasn't important. What was important was that we were on guard." End of chapter 7.